Hello, and welcome to a video lecture by Mr. Jim Marrs. Mr. Marrs is an acclaimed national author who wrote the book Crossfire, the definitive investigation into the Kennedy assassination. The following lecture was given on July 12, 1997 in Irving, Texas, and was hosted by the DFW chapter of the Mutual UFO Network. In this lecture, Mr. Marrs discusses his newest book, The Alien Agenda. This book is extremely thought-provoking and is the most extensive investigation into and documentation of the UFO alien phenomena. We now proudly present Mr. Jim Marrs and The Alien Agenda.
To be here, and I'm glad to see such a good turnout. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here because you all are the people who have been studying this issue for years and years and years. And actually, I have too. I've been very interested in the UFO thing since I was a young guy in the 50s. And then as a reporter for the Star-Telegram, I chased the cattle mutilations very extensively there through the mid to late 70s. It's interesting the big change that I've seen take place in the UFO community, because through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, my contacts with the UFO research community tended to be with people that I called the metal ship people. Okay, I've heard them also described as the nuts and bolts people. These are people who generally have an interest and/or a career background in aviation or aerospace or something along like that, and they tended to be the type of person who says, okay, UFOs, what's the power plant? What's the configuration? You know, and how do we work out the physics between, trying to get here to another star system? This is what I call the metal ship people. Along about 1980, when I left the Star-Telegram, I got involved in many things all at once. I suddenly started having a family. We had 2 daughters. Moved to the country and built my own home that's partially underground, partially a log home. I'm still working on that. Seems like every time you get one thing done, something else falls apart, but you know how that works. And then I began to try to set up and run my own country newspaper. And if you think you don't make money working for a newspaper, just try owning one. You go broke real quick. And anyway, needless to say, I was pretty distracted. So my interest in UFOs never diminished, but I kind of got away from the UFO research community there for a while until the late 80s, I guess. So for almost 10 years there, I was kind of away from it, other than just what I'd read in magazines or pick up a book now and then. The thing that got me back into it, well, there were 2 things actually. One is that with the success of Crossfire, which has to do with the Kennedy assassination and the subsequent government cover-up, as I travel around the country, I'd ask people, well, what do you think's the next big, deep, dark government cover-up? You know what? Almost unanimously, people said UFOs. So I suddenly realized that I wasn't the only one who had been having this ongoing fascination and interest with the UFO topic. And the thing that I hesitated at that point, though, is that I didn't feel like confident enough in my own mind as to having any answers. There's 200 books out there already that says, hey, there's something there, there's something there, there's something there. Well, okay, I'd already long come to the conclusion that there's something there. The question now is, who are they and what do they want? What is the alien agenda? Well, before I felt like I could responsibly say anything to anybody, I had to get it pretty set in my mind. Well, what is the alien agenda? And of course, that's been the big problem all along. The thing that really got me moving again was when, about 1992, when I stumbled across the military's remote viewing program. And I think we've been here before and we've talked about remote viewing. I'm not going to go into that too extensively. But once I found out that the remote viewing, which for those of you who may or may, well, let's see a quick show of hands. Everybody knows what remote viewing is, raise your hand. Okay, well, we're pretty much there. Remote viewing basically is just a psychic phenomenon. I think this is what we used to call clairvoyance. It's where you mentally perceive people, places, things at a distance by means other than your five senses. Now, of course, I realize that puts me right into another big controversial cauldron, and that a lot of people say, oh, psychic stuff doesn't work, you know, and I don't know, I call it the psychic hotline, and I say, hey, you're fine, how am I? but I was very skeptical of the I was more skeptical of the psychic phenomenon than I ever have been of the UFO thing. I guess just because all the years and years of reading about the UFOs. But once I really delved into that, and I talked to people who sat on the oversight committees, I talked to the scientists who had worked on this technique, and more importantly, I had talked to more than a dozen of the military intelligence officers who were trained in the use of this technique by our government using your tax dollars. And the fact that the government had done this for more than a quarter of a century and through 4 separate administrations told me that somebody felt like they were getting some use out of this. And of course, I have since become absolutely, unalterably convinced that there is a legitimate, credible phenomenon going on there. Okay, well now what's that got to do with UFOs? Well, when I'm talking with these people who are the government remote viewers, one of the things they were tasked to do when the U.S. Army Security and Intelligence Command set up a operational unit of these guys was that they were tasked to go out and look for Soviet submarines, satellites, high-performance, high-flying aircraft as a spy tool. What are they flying? You know, what does it run on? What kind of power plant? And each and every single one of these people, men and women, working for the government, using a laboratory-tested technique that they term remote viewing to get away from all the baggage having to do with psychic stuff. Each and every one of them came into contact with UFOs. They would go up, they'd see these things flitting through the atmosphere, they'd take a mental look at it, and they'd say, holy cow, this isn't the Russians, and this isn't us. You know, as one guy said, these guys aren't even from the neighborhood. Okay? And they were able to see where these craft were originating from and where they were going to, and they could track them back and they could track them forward. And they, over a period of years, they had seen these things off and on. Now the problem here is that they had never made a concentrated effort to determine, you know, or a study of this. It was always peripheral. It was always they going to go see one. Well, you all have the same experience as I do, I'm sure. You go to look up something and you find something else, right? And you wind up, you know, what should have taken you 5 minutes, takes you an hour and a half, but you stop and read all this interesting stuff that you find on your way to find something else. That's what these people do. They were going to look at something Soviet, and instead they get distracted by seeing something that's not even of this earth. As a result, there was no comprehensive study of the whole thing. But over a period of years, they began to throw their information together into what they called their Enigma files, which I find real interesting because this was long before anybody had ever heard of the term X-Files. But it was real and it was going on within the government. And in fact, in Alien Agenda, this was, as far as I know, the first time that we used a concentrated and formal study of UFOs. And that's another thing I think you'll find very, very fascinating is what they came up with. But through the military developed remote viewing and what I learned from these people and what I learned through that technology, that gave me enough confidence to say that I think I can, in very broad and general terms and admittedly quite spottily, at least begin to come up with some general idea of what's going on with the alien agenda. Well, what is it you want to know? Okay. Years ago, I knew a guy in Fort Worth that was an investigative reporter named Mulder. And he got a job outside of Fort Worth, and one afternoon he called me over to his apartment because he knew I had an interest in the Kennedy assassination. And I went over there, and he had a pile of materials in his living room floor that was about 2 to 3 foot high and about 6 foot in diameter. It was books, magazines, papers, clippings, documents, transcripts, you name it. Just this huge pile. And it all had to do with the Kennedy assassination. And he's wanting to sell it to me, you know, because he knew my interest, and he was trying to raise money to get out of town. Well, I didn't have the money, and I didn't get it, unfortunately. I wished I had that huge pile of material that he had now. But the point of the story is that I said, wow, John, I said, you've accumulated this over the years. He said, yeah, almost ever since the day it happened. I said, well, you certainly have amassed a wealth of information here. I said, well, what does all this mean? What does all this tell you? He just looked at me as blankly as he could be, and he says, I don't know. You know, I just collect this stuff. I don't try to put it all together. Now, some of y'all laugh, but I've run into a lot of people in the UFO community that are the same way. They've spent years collecting the books and articles and the documents, on and on like that, but they never seem to have the time or the willpower to sit down and try to put all that together and say, what does this mean? What do we find in here? You know? And that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Because I don't know how many of y'all have sat back and really considered, you know, what do you really know? And even more so, what does it mean? All right, step one. UFOs represent real, tangible, material objects. Period. How can I say that emphatically? Because certainly in modern times, in the last few years, with the advent of the camcorder, not a week goes by that somebody's not capturing a UFO on videotape. All right? Now, obviously, for years, I paid serious attention to the argument that perhaps UFOs were simply figments of our imagination, some sort of collective psychosis, some sort of modern reaction to technology or something, okay? Or who knows? High tension wires does something in your brain and makes you think that you're seeing something, okay? And believe me, those of you all that have been with this topic a long time, you know that that's been out there and argued for years. Well, it's crap, okay? Because you can't take a picture of hallucination. So, they're real. Plus, if you studied long enough, you know that there's radar contacts, there's ground effects, holes in the ground, smoldering vegetation, you name it. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so now we have to begin to put all that together and say, what does all this mean? And of course, once we start doing this, we run into what I call mindset. And here's a great explanation of mindset. You won't hear the story in Alien Agenda, unfortunately, because I only heard this after the book came out. Years ago, there was a Army transport plane full of military officers, and they're going from one place to another, and on the way they had an encounter with a UFO, a large, cylindrical, glowing orange object that came up, flew along the plane for a while, zoomed around it a couple of times, you know, and then went straight up and disappeared. When they landed, these officers were debriefed, and one of them happened to be an Army psychiatrist. And they asked the psychiatrist, they said, did you see the UFO? And his response was, yes, but I looked away because I don't believe in those things. And I think that pretty well sums up mindset. You got mindset at work here, okay? Let's see a show of hands from everybody in this room who has actually physically been in front of and maybe touched or at least been very close and seen a Chinese panda bear. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 out of us. We saw one in Beijing, and I was about as close to being kin here. There's some bars there, of course, you know. But most of us have never seen a panda bear. So how do you know they exist? Well, you've seen films of them, and you've seen pictures of them, and you've heard from people who said, like me, that said, I've seen them. Okay? So you believe that. Why is it that when somebody says, I've got a picture here of this UFO that I saw, nobody believes them? That's mindset. It's just mindset. Where does mindset come from? It comes from the media, which has been spurred on, encouraged, and egged on by the government. So you've got to set that mindset aside, and you've got to start looking at all the evidence and see where it leads. And so let's see what we do know. All right, we know they're tangible objects. Oh, and let me mention this too. A lot of people like to cite this statistic. Well, Project Blue Book said that only about 20% of the UFO sightings that they studied, fell into the category of unexplained. Okay, and of course they use this to great advantage. That only 20%. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a phony figure. That's a mindset figure, because all you have to do is go back and look how Project Blue Book operated. If you come to Blue Book and tell them you had a sighting, and they say, what part of the sky was it in? And you say, well, it was in the western part of the sky. So they'll check and they'll say, aha, Venus was in the western part of the sky. Bam, it's Venus. Case closed. That one's explained. Well, maybe it was Venus, but I doubt it. Okay, because, so you see what I'm getting at. I think the true statistics are much, much higher. Okay, because let's deal with this. Yes, there are hoaxes. Then let's face it, you'll always find a couple of good old boys that are not above throwing a pipe band into the sky, taking a picture of it, and trying to sell it to the local paper or maybe impress their girlfriend, okay? So yeah, there are hoaxes. And there are even more honest misinterpretations of natural or mundane phenomena, okay? I'm sure that goes on, yes, okay? But within all that, as you all are more than aware, is a significant percentage of instances with high strangeness that is unexplainable by conventional and mundane means. And again, they try to pull that down to 20%, but I'm telling you it's much more than that. And as you all are well aware too, this is a global phenomenon. It's not just the United States. This goes all over. All right, now, so we've got one problem is the mindset. Here's the other problem. I'm going to just tell you a little story about a guy named Peter. And I'm not going to give you his real name because I don't want to get him in trouble. But Peter worked for one of the major TV networks. And his job was on the weekends, he would review all of the news that were coming out over their affiliate stations, and he would decide which of those news stories would interest a national audience and which ones then that he would put on the network news that would go out across the nation to all the stations. He said there were only two types of stories that required prior approval before he could send it out over the wire. One was terrorism. Okay, I guess we could see where there needs to be some kind of, concern over stories regarding terrorism. But he said even on the terrorism stories, they would mostly all come back. Sometimes they'd say, let's don't talk about this aspect, or let's kind of play down this end of it. But they would still come back, and those stories generally would go ahead and move. He said the other type of stories was UFOs. And he said when it came to UFO stories, they never came back. Now, this explains what I've tried to tell people for years. This is the control of the U.S. news media. Not that they control every editor and reporter out there, because they don't. Most of those people are hard-working, conscientious people. They control the distribution of the information. Just since the beginning of this year, there have been major UFO flaps in the Boston